Hello, everyone. Welcome to the first episode of The Partners Brief, a podcast initiative by NALSAR University of Law. Through this platform, we aim to bring you engaging conversations with leading practitioners from the legal industry, with a focus on law firms, commercial law, and building commercial awareness. Our guest today is Mr. Akshay Jaitley, co-founder of Trilegal, one of India's most prominent law firms, and the author of the recently released book, Trilegal, The Making of a Modern Indian Law Firm. He's a renowned expert in cross-border strategy, energy, and infrastructure law. His journey includes studying at St. Stephen's College, Columbia University, and Oxford University. He worked on climate policy before practicing law in London and Tokyo. Beyond his legal career, Mr. Jaitley is a dedicated athlete who has completed numerous full marathons. Hello, sir. Welcome to the episode.
Thank you. My pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Yes, sir. So, diving deep into the podcast, our first question, you might be anticipating the theme of our first question. It's on artificial intelligence, something that everyone's discussing about nowadays. So, in one of the previous interviews, you had said that artificial intelligence will not replace lawyers, but lawyers who use artificial intelligence will replace the lawyers who don't. When we students look at it from our point of view, we are more often than not discouraged from using artificial intelligence, either could be in our colleges or internships, etc., but understandably so. So, in your opinion, just wanted to know, what would be this ideal balance? Because artificial intelligence, like we're now getting to know, it's inevitable almost. So what would be the balance between using artificial intelligence, any tools you have in mind in our internships, college, career, etc.?
I think need to think about this in a slightly sort of different kind of way, which is what are the processes by which we develop the skills to do analytical thinking, and the process is by reading, by reviewing, by thinking about things, etc. And suppose let's take the analogy of another human being. Suppose that instead of doing the reading and writing and thinking yourself, you were to go to your friend and you were to say, who has already done the reading and writing and thinking, and you go to them, just sit and tell me what this is all about. So the friend will give you 5 points, and you will have the 5 points, so you'll be able to repeat them, but your brain wouldn't have gone through the process of coming up with those 5 points. So artificial intelligence, basically at this point in time at least, is that friend. It is someone who can help you, and let's leave aside the fact that it can make mistakes. Let's assume that what it says is true. But you will have lost out on that whole thought process that allows you to develop arguments for yourself. So I think the importance for students is to use it as a research tool, perhaps, more than a tool to come up with answers. And again, here, of course, it's important to acknowledge the fact that it can make mistakes and often does. And there are certain types of analytical thinking it just cannot do. So what it will, and it's sort of, artificial intelligence is sort of incentivized to give you an answer irrespective of whether it knows the answer or not. And what it's doing is pattern recognition. It has been trained with enormous amounts of data, and it looks for patterns within that data. What you and I as human beings do is we can actually find connections in things which are apparently unconnected. And that and that is a question of experience, and as having had that experience ourselves and being able to make those connections. So while, as I was saying, it's important, in fact, it is important actually to use it because it's very efficient, but you have to at the same time make sure that you're not allowing it to replace your own judgment. So that is the challenge. I don't have a solution for that, but that is the challenge. And at the workplace, we are increasingly asked by clients to use it, and we are asked, how can we save costs by using AI? But the question I would have is, if I don't have an associate who's trained, then I will never have a good senior associate who will never then become a good partner. So I think what law firms, and in fact anyone in the knowledge business in any way, will have to think about is, how do you develop training methodologies which make up for the efficiencies that artificial intelligence provide, but at the same time don't allow students to the analytical processes that enable them to build their own thinking. So I think that's how I look at the whole issue.
Understood, sir. It makes so much sense. This was also like a recent reading I was doing, the difference between generative AI and agentic AI. So nowadays, agentic AI is in, like you said, generative AI is trained more so to only find answers in the knowledge base that it has, and it almost always agrees. Even when you chat with like probably any software like ChatGPT, Gemini, etc., it always affirms the prompt that you've given, and it only elaborates. It has never happened that it does not affirm. While now that's where the agentic AI is coming in, which is trying to like give like arguments against, etc. I think that's another debate that we'll venture into. But
Yeah, but even the arguments that it gives against will come from the its own database.
understood.
And this ability to make connections between unconnected things. Like, for example, a human being might listen to a piece of music, and that piece of music might connect it to a piece of art because there's something in the emotional experience of that moment that triggers something in your thought process. I'm not an expert on AI, but I don't think AI can do that right now. And the same thing is if I'm thinking about a power project today, and if I'm working on a power project and trying to structure it, I might have done a waste project many years ago in another jurisdiction where there was one small quirky element which actually has the key to the solution for that I'm looking for in my power project. So I don't think AI is there yet. So we are not getting replaced that quickly.
Understood, sir. Makes so much sense. The second question, this is something that I had come across while reading your book. So Trilegal, when it started out, it had offices in Delhi, Mumbai, and Bangalore, and you said there was a specific logic, understandably so, because they are the so-called legal hubs. But in today's world, do you think the same kind of logic would stand ground? Because do you think law firms need to like expand themselves, tap into the potential of other cities? So, what is your take on that in today's world?
It's a good question, and in fact, we've now opened an office in Chennai
Yeah.
because that city now has a level of sophistication of economy where clients in that over there are looking for services from law firms such as ours. So there's always a balance between how much do you open an office to tap potential versus how much do you open an office to actually be profitable. So sometime we had an office in Hyderabad many years ago, which we closed because it was paying for itself, but it wasn't really growing very much. Maybe today we might look at it differently. And it's quite funny. We've noticed an interesting phenomenon in the past that from some of these smaller cities, which are powerful in their own right and got their own economies, very often these clients in those cities will be willing to pay higher fees to a lawyer who comes from fancy Delhi and Bombay rather than somebody who's equally good in their own city. So there is this slight sort of infra-dig kind of approach that people get. And we found that earlier in Madras, which is why we didn't open there. Now that has changed. Clients have realized that the advice is worth it and I want them at my doorstep. So we lawyers are we are almost by definition reactive. So we react to needs from our clients, and we can't really go and set up, say, in Pune and try and create a market there. The market in Pune has to mature to a point where it makes sense for us to do it. Some firms do have offices in smaller jurisdictions or in smaller cities, and they probably have it because they've got one or two key clients who want them to be there, and that's a good reason. But in general, you have to really think hard about the economics. What fee levels will a city support before you open an office there?
Makes sense. A similar kind of anxieties and beliefs also exist among students when they're looking for internships, where they're only like focusing on Delhi, Mumbai, kind of cities. But yeah, what you said is true. The third question would be on something that I've observed in general, the first generation anxiety that lawyers have. For example, I come a family of doctors and engineers. I do not see the same kind of anxiety for a first generation doctor or a first generation engineer. I mean, obviously it's there, but not as much as how much a first generation lawyer would have. So I feel like it's more so maybe in litigation backgrounds. I am not really sure because there's this notion that okay, you will have like some kind of setup if your parents are already like in the field. So what do you think? Does the same carry in the corporate world? What's your general take on that?
Well, I think in corporate law, I think we've moved past that. I think if you go to a good university and if you're a good student, the chances are that you're going to get a decent job. And in that situation, no one's really looking for whether you came from a family of lawyers or not. We've certainly moved on from there. I think in terms of law firm ownership, we haven't necessarily moved on from when Trilegal set up as much as I would have liked to have seen. But if you look at the top 100 firms today, the vast majority of them are first generation lawyers. Not vast majority, but certainly a majority of them. However, in the top 10 firms, the vast majority are family owned firms. So the family owned firms have remained quite resilient and have adapted in the face of changing circumstances. But I don't think anyone who wants to do law should bother too much about the fact that they had a family in the law. Of course, connections matter in any profession. So if you know people and you can get a good interview in a good firm or a good internship in a good firm, then that enhances your chances. But that needn't be because you come from a lawyer's family. It could be because one of your parents went to college or school with somebody there, or as a client or whatever. There could be various reasons why you have a connection. So connections, I think, will always remain important. And it's not, I sort of don't like this term of nepo baby kind of thing, because I think that if any one of us as human beings, if we are provided with two choices of two people to hire with equal ability, but we know the background of one of them, we'll be inclined to go towards the known person because it's just safer to do that. And it's also it's sort of an human instinct of survival. You will go with the familiar. So I think that's a natural and an acceptable thing. But I think that anyone who hasn't done law before, like you, shouldn't worry too much. If you're going to be, you have to back yourself. If you're good, you will get a good job and you'll have a good career.
Makes sense, sir. Makes sense. My next question is on a remark that you had said when you'd come to NALSAR for a book discussion. I was there in the session too, and one of the students had basically asked that what's like the one thing that needs to be done in the legal field, one untapped potential, and you said we should have like a litigation style firm with like a corporate structure, which was missing, and I thought that was really interesting. So could you elaborate? And that's when I ideated the podcast also, I had thought that this would be one of the things that I would ask, sir, for sure. So could you elaborate a bit more on that?
Yeah, I think that if you look at mature jurisdictions, you've got lots of law firms which are full service law firms like ours, but you've also got some litigation only powerhouses which are relatively new. So I think that it's not that India doesn't have litigation only firms, but they tend to be the traditional firms that tend to be family dominated. I think just as we occupied a space in the market that was available for a firm of our kind, which is broadly based and widely held and one partner, one vote, etc. I think if a group of litigation folks came together and set up a firm of that kind, there is space in the market for a firm like that to grow with a similar kind of model, because it'll attract similarly entrepreneurial people like we did, and it'll attract people who feel that the sky is the limit, who don't want glass ceilings, but today are confronted with them. And I think that's one part of it. The other part of it is increasingly high quality litigation is being done by law firms, especially in commercial litigation. The economy has become much more complex, transactions are more complex, and it requires specialized both legal and sectoral knowledge to come up with a good litigation strategy and to be able to execute it. And in that context, that's the kind of thing that law firms are able to offer. And very often, litigations can involve inputs from various different types of teams. If there's an M&A litigation, related litigation in the infrastructure field, you need knowledge of how road concessions work, you'll need knowledge of financing, you'll need knowledge of course, corporate law and shareholders agreements and those kinds of things. And for that, it's increasingly hard for any single individual, however brilliant they might be as a senior counsel, to have all of that. So I think law firms with that sort of knowledge and that sort of experience are now getting to see most of the best litigation. So if you put together the fact that there isn't a litigation firm which is structured in a more broad-based sense, and the fact that high quality litigation is being done in law firms, it points to the fact that there's potentially space for a law firm that specializes in litigation. I quoted, I think, the example of a firm called Quinn Emanuel,
Yeah.
which was set up maybe 30 years ago, not too far away from when we were set up, which was a litigation-only firm, breakaway from some of the older firms, and which is one of the top litigation firms in the U.S. now.
Yeah, yeah, you did quote the film, sir. So yes, sir, that was a great answer. My next question, your answer leads to my next question. So when Trilegal was first set up, one of the signature moves of Trilegal was not to use any names on the door and have Trilegal as the from the beginning. But still, there was in the early lineup there were still names like Hazarika Prasad Jetli, Singhan Gorti, and Mathan and Ayappa. So, have you ever thought how it would have impacted differently if, since the beginning, you had gone with Trilegal?
As you're saying, we wanted to make a point about the fact that we were departing from the law firms of the past, or rather the traditional law firms that existed. And one way to do that was in the form of a name. I don't think that it would have been an absolute a deal breaker if we'd had names on the door. In the event that there'd been only three of us and we'd used three names. Six names is really too much to have. Excuse me. But if we'd had only three names, it might still have worked, because ultimately it's the substance that matters more than the form and the tagline. But it was a way to make a statement that we thought was important at the time. The reason we did the names first and the trilegal below was because we didn't know each other that well, and we didn't know how well the whole thing was going to succeed. Give me a second, please. As a consequence of which, we wanted to sort of hedge our bets a little bit, but we put Trilegal down there saying this is going to be our name. We aspire for that to be our name, and that we'll flip to the first step will be to flip to having Trilegal on top and the names below, so that people are not confused by this a sudden change of the name completely, and then we'll get rid of the names, and that's what we did. And I think in the end, if you have a neutral name, it allows everybody to own that name. You don't you will feel some degree of separation from the firm, especially for a first generation firm. Now, for a White and Case, for example, Mr. White and Mr. Case are not around, so nobody cares that it's called White and Case. It's perfectly all right. In fact, I know that there are some people who've chosen two names which are unconnected with their firm, where you just call it, it's just like a stamp. You could say Singh and Sharma, and it would be that would work even if no one was called that. But that seemed a bit contrived to do something like that. So we said, okay, let's have a name. And also, it was in at the turn of the millennium. It was a sort of time where people were looking to do things in a fresh manner, and that's another reason why we chose it.
Makes sense, sir. I think in the book also you do mention that because there's six of us and we end up using all names, like it's inevitable that some names are going to be dropped because no one's going to put in the effort of saying all of those six words, and that wouldn't be fair for the surnames of the people who were there. So, and it also makes sense that if we have like a neutral name, everyone would have the equal amount of connection towards that name. That makes total sense, sir. You'd also mentioned that in the early days, working diligently for firms like ANO and Acers was what eventually, came around, brought in clients, etc. This is a logic I feel like is common even like when what parents tell us that, oh, do your work diligently, even if like no one's like really overlooking you, it comes around, etc. So that is what I try to do in my internships too. So this outlook did help me. So what is your take on that? Did that help you guys? Could you just
I
elaborate on
think, I think what more can you do? The what you can do is you can work hard and do your best, and then you do need luck and circumstance and other things to come around to help you. Some people work very hard and don't get the level of success that we've got, and there are other reasons for that. But if you don't do the hard work, then that's the sort of price of entry. You don't get a ticket to the game if you don't work hard. So that has to be the first step. And I think that's something that all parents tell their children. even if they didn't completely do it themselves, because all of us, we all know of times when we could have worked harder and we didn't work as hard as we could have, but we worked hard enough at the right time. And people who have some success in as students, tend to be able to work hard when it really matters. So I think, yeah, that I don't think that adage is going to get particularly old, and it did work for us. I mean, we also were at a time when law firms in India were quite new, or at least modern style law firms doing deals in a liberalization in a liberalizing economy. That was quite a new phenomenon, and no one could claim to have had decades of experience in doing those kinds of transactions in sectors that had only just opened up.
Yeah.
So it was easier for us uh, to set ourselves apart just by hard work, because nobody else had the experience. So that was really the determining factor. And perhaps I don't know. Perhaps some of the legacy firms were slightly complacent. They'd always had work; they were around, and they didn't expect that there would be a bunch of young firms which would come in and sort of try and find ways to set themselves apart. At that point, people would have, some of our competitors would have said, we're a 100-year-old firm. We've got, our family has been involved throughout. We've got this great continuity and knowledge, etc. That's what they would have said. And at the same time, we were saying things like, uh, we are young, we are fresh, we are not, we don't have the baggage of the past. We were saying exactly the opposite. And international clients in particular were willing to hear that, because international clients were more concerned at the time by, how are you going to solve my problem? How are you going to do my deal? As opposed to, who do you know? How many of your family members are in the profession? How many years has your firm been in existence? Because the economy was modernizing, and that the traditional kind of experience only took you so far.
Understood. Understood that, sir. One thing that was really surprising for me to read in the book was that for the first 10 years, you had said there was no specialized disputes team in the firm, and only after the 10th year is when a disputes team was set up. And today, your disputes team is one of the best in the country. So, how did you manage the 10-year gap to start, considering it's an essential, like an essential practice in a law firm? The disputes team. So just wanted to know your take on that.
No, that's a good question. And the way we managed was that, well, one of our founders, Anand Prasad, had been a litigator to start off with, so he had some idea. And what we did was we worked with a bunch of both junior and senior external counsel to do the disputes that came our way. And in some cases, we just had to pass on those disputes to other people, which really hurt us. But we would rather have passed on the work to someone who knew what they were doing, rather than try and do something that we may not have been so good at. And because the credibility you lose with a client is going to be worse off for you in the long run, rather than whatever fees you make doing one dispute. So we did, but having said that, we did some pretty significant disputes in the early days, and we did it by again, some amount of hard work, and then working with external counsel. And some of the junior counsel we worked with then sort of grew with the firm and are now reasonably well-known senior counsel themselves. So that's the main strategy. And the other senior counsel, well-known ones like Rajiv Nair, etc., had sort of they liked what we did. And what we did was we prepared good briefs for them. We did our research well. We had some sectoral knowledge in, say, telecoms disputes and things of that kind. And so that kind of that helped us as well. So, but it was clear to us that we needed to build a strong disputes practice, because there would be a point when a client would say, "Look, I need the full package, and not just transactional work." And so, yeah, around 2010 is when we took our first real steps to do that.
Understood, sir. That's very interesting to know. My next question is, I thought if someone today comes to you and says, how do I build the next trilegal? And you've really emphasized on how initially when your firm was being set up, it had come in the backdrop of the 1991 reforms, the liberalization, etc. And today I feel like one big change that's happening is technology, AI, and the fast growth there. So, with the playbook for building a trilegal like firm, where would it change? How would you address the how aspect? And if I were to come to you and ask you, what would your go to advice for me be?
Well, I think it's going to be hard in today's world to build any form of large law firm. I think there are now well-established 10, 12 big firms who dominate the landscape, and setting up a new firm is hard. Now, when we set up, the largest firm probably had 100 lawyers. So, to go up the curve, to come close to them, you could have 20 lawyers quite quickly and you'd be, one-fifth the size of the largest firm. Today, to be one-fifth the size of the largest firm, you need 250 lawyers. It's a whole different story. So it's not so easy to do, but the playbook is going to remain the same, with one or two differences. I think that, in fact, it's quite interesting. The managing director of one of the large PE funds recently was speaking to me and was talking about, if a new law firm were to be set up, it would be an AI-driven law firm. It would be a law firm based on AI. And yes, that's true, but I think also that firms like ours have the resources and the wherewithal to integrate AI more than perhaps a startup might do, because it's one thing to have these publicly available platforms, AI models to use. It's another thing to have it trained in all the requirements of a law firm, and we've gone through that training process, and it isn't a simple thing to do. But I think the lessons that you would have to do out of the gate, or the things that you would have to follow out of the gate, is to put the client at the center of what you do, to think really commercially. I think lawyers in India still not often enough put themselves in the shoes of the client. When the client comes to you with a transaction or a question, they're not thinking of, oh, I want some great legal advice. They're thinking, how do I do my business? So to orient your advice to the client in terms of how they're going to run their business or make a new investment or set up a new project is something that's absolutely critical, and that's still not deeply embedded in the Indian legal landscape. The best lawyers will do that, the best firms will do that, but it's not something that happens across the board. There's still this slightly professorial advice that tends to be given, which is like, here's the advice, now you decide what you want to do with it. What a client wants to know is, okay, this is my problem. Yes, that's your advice. What would you do? And to be able to have the confidence to say, okay, this is what I would do, with some caveats, of course, uh, is what a good lawyer would do. So keeping the client's commercial interests in mind is really important. And I think the way that I think structure is critical. How do you incentivize motivated, ambitious people over long periods of time? You do it by giving them a say in how the firm is run. You do it by giving them a share of ownership, both actual ownership as well as psychological ownership. I think in today's world, if you want to really build a successful firm, you have to do that, because the best people they'll want lots of money, they'll want the best work, and they'll want authority, power, the right to shape their own destiny, all of that. And if a firm doesn't provide that, then it doesn't stand a chance to grow big. So those are the necessary conditions. But it's a tough, as I started off by saying, the market is dramatically different today as compared to when we set up. So the space for a large firm or a firm to become a large firm is more constrained.
Understood, sir. That makes total sense. And that brings me to my last question, which is obviously on the lockstep model, which was also elaborately written about in the book. One thing that really caught my attention and I thought it was really interesting was that you said lawyers at a certain level, like the third and the fourth level, in order to progress to the next level, need to also train and promote their juniors. And I thought that was a mechanism with a very interesting underlying belief that one person's, it's so interwoven, one person's success depends on the other person's success, right? So I just thought that kind of a belief underlying the whole structure was really important, and there are similarly so many other values that you've talked about in the book. So just wanted to know your perspective on this.
Yeah, I think, in any model where everything is put in to a pot and then that pot is shared out, how do you sort of grow? You grow by increasing the size of the pot, and any partner can supervise only a certain number of associates. And since we don't have salaried partners as many other firms do, you're not supervising any other partners, you're only supervising associates. So some firms will say that, oh, X partner has a book of 80 crores. Now, the only way that partner can have a book of 80 crores is if they got four salaried partners working under them or five salaried partners working under them. That our model doesn't allow for. So the growth and the building of a book and to expanding the size of a practice is done by creating new partners. And because we're an all equity firm, those new partners have to have the technical ability to be able to deliver because they're being given ownership of a small part of the firm. So as a result of that, the need to train people well so that then they will become good partners is then woven into the incentive system of existing partners. So who are obviously the only people who can train other people to become partners. You can't bring in, professional people from outside to train someone. This is learning on the job. It's learning by seeing. It's learning by experiencing. It's hearing how someone speaks to a client on a phone call when there's a sticky situation. How does someone deal with an associate who is upset because of something personal or professional? How do you deal with conflicts of interest when they come about? These are subtle things which again AI will not be able to teach you. So you need to learn through observation, and that's the kind of training that our partners get on the job, and our existing partners are incentivized to do that because it's going to grow the pie and it's going to get you more points over time. So I think it's quite a good system in terms of interlocking incentives.
Understood, sir. That's a beautiful system you have there. That brings me to the end of this podcast. It was a pleasure having you here, sir. We look forward to interacting with you more. And this was an amazing inaugural episode, even for our initiative. Thank you, sir. Thank you so much.
Not at all. My pleasure, and thanks for taking the time to